Welcome to Parenting Teens with Dr. Cam, a podcast about navigating adolescence without losing our minds. Each week, I guide you around the teenage landmines with practical tips, simple solutions, and words of encouragement. I'm your host, Dr. Cam. Let's get on with the show. Welcome, parents. Over the past decade, there has been a noticeable increase in the number of teenagers coming out as transgender. To skeptical parents, this is often perceived as a concerning trend fueled by social media and easily influenced teenage brains. To gender identity experts, it is attributed to increased awareness and understanding of gender diversity and the growing platforms that enable teens to find resources, support, and connections with others who have similar experiences. Regardless of what you believe, if your teen is questioning their identity, how you respond as a parent can have an enormous impact on their long-term mental health and their well-being. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Ronnie Gladden, an international speaker, actor, and tenured college professor who speaks regularly about identity, diversity, and inclusion for K-12 schools, universities, and nonprofits. They are also the author of White Girl Within, Letters of Self-Discovery Between a Transgender and Transracial Black Man and His Inner Female. Dr. Ronnie is going to help us navigate some of the complexities of gender identity and provide guidance on how to best support teens who identify as transgender. Welcome, Dr. Ronnie. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just start with a backstory, because I know you've got an amazing story. What led you to today where you are an advocate for children of all identities?
As a child myself, I recognized that what I saw in the mirror did not match back with my imagination. It did not match back with my internal voice. It didn't match back with my internal standard. And I found that to be interesting. And I was just 4 years old. So a lot of us are walking contradictions. So I'm not unique in that way. Many of us are. That's why there's the whole notion of Jung's shadow theory and doing shadow work to integrate what is otherwise repressed, suppressed, and oppressed within us. But for me, the walking contradiction is pretty well amplified, the opposite of everything. So feeling as if I align more so with white females as opposed to Black male identity. And I think perhaps a part of that could have been from some turbulence that was in the household. Unfortunately, I did have a handed father that was aggressive with myself. He was aggressive with my mother. So that certainly created some angst. And there were some other things culturally that were there. But in spite of processing that through counseling, through a lot of college degrees, through a lot of professional work, this is still with me all of these decades later. So what was there at 4 is still here with me now today as a tenured college professor. So this is more than just an imaginary friend or something that's just like a phase. This is insistent, consistent, persistent, authentic. And so that just leads me to think that that is true for other people, especially young people of today. I still recognize that it's rare, that this is rare, but there's a light that shined on this, and more people that perhaps otherwise would have remained silenced are now coming out. So it seems like that there is more of people that are declaring that they are trans or what have you. But it is a real thing for probably the minority of us, but it is real.
So I would love to dig into this a little bit because, I have a lot of clients. I know a lot of people that are questioning their gender identity. And a lot of times the adults and parents in their lives are saying, this is a phase. You don't know what you're talking about. You'll get through it. I'm not accepting it because I know you're going to get through this. And if I don't accept it, eventually you'll just get over it. Right. I see a lot of this. What do you say to these parents whose kids are very vocally questioning their gender during a time where many of us see it as you don't know any better yet.
Yeah, I love the question. I think that you have to be careful about superimposing your viewpoint onto someone else.
Mm,
We're all sentient beings. And I say this with all due respect to the parents. You're not raising kids, you're really raising adults. You are
yeah.
raising people that are going to become, full-fledged folks in their own majority with their own complex identities and minds. And going back to what we were saying before about holding on to traditions and expectations, we have to be careful not to be too rigid in that manner. That said, it is true that the data that I've seen does say that many kids will desist. So if they believe that they are transgender, for example, most by a certain point, as they move into the tween ages, will desist and will find a kind of balance in their assigned gender.
Mm,
That is true based on the statistics. At the same time, though, if you are seeing something that seems insistent, consistent, persistent with kids, where they really are showing signs of being dysphoric, why not explore that? That doesn't mean you have to go on puberty blockers for them, or that you have to, get them on the waiting list for gender affirming surgery. It could mean let's process this through counseling. Let's
yeah.
process this with the teachers. Let's consider some sort of a treatment plan, some sort of, if there's an IEP that's needed, let's look and see if there may be something else that could lie beneath the surface, such as neurodivergence, because sometimes that's a part of it. That's where you have people that can learn different ways other than the norm. There are multiple intelligences that Howard Gardner has spoken of. I'm sure you've heard
Mm-hmm.
of those.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and we need to be able to factor that in. So effectively, what I'm saying is, why not look to see how you can investigate this, investigate underlying root causes. I mentioned before my own story that there is a history of domestic violence, that there
Mhm.
is, and I didn't add, a history of bullying, that there is, other sorts of idiosyncrasies I've worked to contextualize. And in a similar way, I think that parents could do that with their kids too. And for a small cohort, you are going to see that in spite of all of that processing, yes, this is someone that is, with gender dysphoria, and therefore you would absolutely want to help them to work with that in an age appropriate way and in a way that is investigating all of the options.
Dr. Ronnie, I love the way that you are addressing this because it is a very practical, let's just not like let it, just don't question it at all, right? Which I think some people are just like, just let it be. And I think this is where people are struggling. It's a let's take it seriously. This
Yeah,
is a lot. I mean, teenagers and adults too, we're always exploring who we are. We're always trying to
exactly.
figure that out. I think what we're seeing now is when we were growing up, sorry, I'm putting you in my generation, but when we were growing up, that wasn't an option. It wasn't something that you even considered. So people probably just didn't know, didn't understand what was going on. Now they can go, this is an option. Let me figure out if that explains what's going on inside. If that explains some of the inconsistencies, it may or may not. But if we don't give them the space to explore it, they'll never know.
Yeah, and that would be, what a shame to not to begin to investigate more about your child's gender identity when there are all of these resources, when there are
Yeah.
esteemed professionals, people that are in various gender clinics. There are lots of workshops, there are lots of programs that exist. So there's literature that's there that you can read. There are even just great places, YouTube episodes that you can watch. There are podcasts like this one. Like, you can be overwhelmed and inundated with all of the support options that are there. There are support groups on Facebook, etc. Like there's PFLAG, for instance. I'm sure you know of that
Yeah.
one, and that's, around the country. Lots of chapters there. There's Listen. There's the Trevor Project. There's so many. So yeah, it would seem like you would at least want to begin to investigate and just to research. There's no harm in that.
Yeah. I kind of want to address too, because a lot of parents, we want our kids to have the easiest path possible. We just do, right? And so when parents see their kids leaning towards this or questioning their gender, questioning their sexuality, any of that, they're like, I don't want you to do that because that's going to create a harder path for you.
Sure.
And what I end up seeing is a lot of parents kind of denying it or pulling it back or trying to change it. And I kind of have a belief of this, but I want to get from you, Ronnie, Dr. Ronnie, how do you perceive that? And how can parents best support their kids as they're going through this questioning, particularly when they're coming from the mindset of, I don't want this for my kid because I feel like it's going to create more hardship.
Yeah. And that's an excellent question as well, too. I almost think that if it weren't the issue of gender being difficult to navigate with, or their sexuality or what have you, then it would be something else. Something else would be a challenge for that child. While I'm not a parent, I can appreciate that parents may want to not have their kids make the same mistakes that they did, or to at least to create a straighter path towards success, stability, predictability. And that's all worthwhile. But there is that thing of the notion of being a helicopter parent as
Mm-hmm.
well too. Like there are limitations in terms of what you can do to insulate, and you may unintentionally do more harm by creating silos, by creating a kind of artificial environment where maybe you have overly stage managed the life of the child in such a way that you over deliver safeguards, that you stunt that child in a way that then it's more difficult for them to have the kinds of coping mechanisms that they'll need when they are confronted with other kinds of challenges. It's a sort of resistance. I've seen studies that look at Gen Z having a really difficult time with navigating the land of work. They're having
Mm-hmm.
a lot of time, and I've
Mm-hmm.
seen by thousands. One survey, it surveyed thousands of managers that say that they have had to let Gen Z individuals go or to reprimand them at work because there seems to be this kind of militant apathy with them, or not fully engaging, or not having some of the soft skills to that are necessary to nurture certain kinds of rapport and relationships that's there. Well, we just had a pandemic. So what's ended up happening, you've had people kind of in this artificial environment where otherwise they would have interacted with people face to face and would have had varying abilities to discern between nonverbal cues and what should you say and shouldn't say in the workplace, but you haven't had that. Everything has been limited to a screen, to the two-dimensional,
Yeah.
to the digital. And I kind of see that playing out with, well, you want things to be easier for your child. Well, sure, but you wouldn't want to create unnecessary challenges, but you have the reality of the world being where it is, and maybe the strategy is to focus on adaptability skills, coping skills, as opposed to, well, let me insulate you to make it easier, only then to trade off and end up creating a whole other problem where it's harder to adult, or to be independent in an environment.
Yeah, I see that across the board with a lot of different things. And I think it's very hard because as parents, we want to protect our kids, but we do it at the sacrifice of them learning to take care of and protect themselves.
Yeah,
Right. So I think it's very interesting that you're pulling all this together, because I love that this is all related, right? This is not this like off the wall, strange thing way over here. This is part of the whole spectrum of everything they're going through. Right.
exactly.
The other thing I see too, and I'm curious of your perspective of this, is when we as parents, in our attempt to make sure that they don't go a route, and again, I see this in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different realms, when we want to prevent them from going a route that might make their life more difficult or make them more of a target of bullying, we end up being the very ones that are perceived as the bully or not accepting them because we're telling them they're not okay as they actually are, rather than saying, we're going to accept you as you are. We're going to be your support and we're going to be your foundation because life might be harder for you. We're not going to be the ones that make it harder for you, though. And I
Right.
think parents often we mess that up a little bit. What do you think to that?
Yeah, well, it's funny how that works. I think that ties back into the walking contradictions that
Yeah.
we were discussing before too. It's like, yeah, you could very well be perpetuating bullying or other kinds of systemic discrimination by saying, "Oh, well, there's something that's wrong here, so you have to change." Well, you can reverse that around and ultimately work to create the environment that is supportive. You know,
Yeah.
there's a lot of angst that I had growing up that I spoke about, but through the angst has come artistry. You know, through the
Mm,
angst has come academic pursuits and accomplishments. Through the angst has come greater authenticity. So it's like having been crushed. Yeah, I mean, there were certain things that were rather difficult and still
yeah.
are, but rather than collapsing under the weight of the angst, of the adversity, you know, of adversarial people, I found a way to, as Malcolm X said, to attack my ignorance and find a way to posit it in places where it becomes literature, like you mentioned the book
Yeah.
White Girl Within, you know, where it can become, you are now a tenured professor or what have you. So you could very well have in your own children, you know, parents, whatever is that problem, whatever is that adversity that's inside of your child's life, there could be a strategy in that that may just as well translate into some sort of advocacy or translate into some sort of major accomplishment that can
Yeah.
happen through that. And there's lots of legal mechanics to go through, and it's needed because there's all this legislation now that's anti-trans. But you know what? What we don't hear about as often is there are some sanctuary cities as well
Mm,
too. Like, you
mhm,
know, Kansas City, Missouri is now a sanctuary city for LGBTQ plus.
mm.
I believe Minnesota is a sanctuary state. So you have
Wow.
that. We know that California, of course, is also sanctuary state, and probably some of the other Western states, if they haven't fully declared that they're sanctuary, they are at least friendly and have the kinds of infrastructure that's there. That's a way to tap into that
Yeah.
to help to better understand or explore your child's true identity and their authenticity to see if it's there. If it isn't, well, then at the very least you may then be inclined to be an ally, and you are that much more steeped in
Mm,
understanding and compassion that can extrapolate not just to LGBTQ plus people, but to the dignity and worth of human beings and respecting human diversity across. But to put a fine point on it, yes, look at the angst and see how you can flip it and leverage that, because there's very likely something to come out of that on the other side that can be rather significant.
yeah. I think just to like kind of simplify that too a little bit from what I'm hearing is you don't have a choice who your child is. You don't make your child who they are. You have
Right.
your child to raise who they are. When we try to push them to be what we want them to be or think they should be, we are preventing them from being who they're supposed to be.
Oh yeah.
And we're stunting them and what they're meant to be here. And I think that is the thing that we keep missing. We're trying so hard to make them what we think they should be. We're denying them of who they are.
Yeah, for sure. And I would have to imagine as a parent that you still have your own internal standard, you still
Mm,
have your own moral compass, you have your own values that may include your faith.
yeah.
And so then you have to respect that. And so these are things that aren't going to be solved overnight. So you have to try to work with that. But this can be, I think, really good for people that are thinking about becoming parents.
Yeah.
Even before that, is to really think, are you prepared to perhaps birth a child, sire a child into reality? And they could be the exact opposite of what you envision, or they can do something that you wouldn't expect. What if your child is smarter than you? What
Yeah.
if your child is a genius? What if your child is more accomplished? Could you handle being known as so and so's parent?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So these are some things to think about uh before you parent. But for those who are parents, it's like, yeah, that this is a lot to process. But I think that if they're listening to this, then they are certainly interested in wanting to have strategies.
Yeah, yeah. The listeners are pretty awesome here. They're
I can
definitely like
imagine. I can
open to all
imagine.
of that, right?
Yeah.
Can we dig into something a little controversial that I think people are really struggling with is, and you had just mentioned it earlier, which is why I'm kind of going there, is, this gender affirming treatments. Um, when there's so many laws being put down, there's so much controversy about this. What are the right ages? I'm just curious, for somebody who is experiencing and is internalizing this, what are your thoughts about how parents can support their teenagers who may be asking to go through some of these gender affirming treatments?
I think, and this may sound a little contradictory
Mhm.
to what I said before, but really I don't think it is. I think it's useful for the parent as well as the child to know both sides of the coin. So
Mhm.
when it comes to gender affirming, the notion is probably the outcome. You want the gender euphoria. You want to have the congruity instead of being misaligned. And I get that. And you can see some really great YouTube vids,
Mm,
and you see the before and you see the after, and it can be amazing.
mm,
Right. But then the risk with that is you've reduced something very complex to a binary. You've reduced something
mm.
that's very complex almost to a sales pitch, kind of in the way that it's been said about PowerPoint. PowerPoint is awesome, but I've heard that PowerPoint is evil because it reduces everything to a sales pitch, just with the
Oh, yeah,
frames
yeah,
and
yeah.
structures it, you know. And so you can almost, if you're not careful, be sold on something from
Mm,
this
mm.
to that, and it's this binary. So when I say the other side, I'm saying you should know what you're in for in terms of the risks, in terms
Yeah,
of being sterilized. You should understand that there are complications with surgeries that could be lifelong. The dependence that's required with respect to being on HRT and knowing that that is for life. There are reports that I've seen that show with estrogen, for example, that there's a risk of blood clotting.
mhm.
There's a risk of other sorts of cardiovascular issues. So while you may very well be able to do some amazing things with the therapies and the interventions that are there, you have to understand that it is serious business and that it needs to be investigated on a case by case basis. What are your lipids? What range of hormones are you in right now? What's your, and this may sound a little bit much for someone that's young, but given the obesity rates and younger individuals even having what have been known as middle age and adult diseases, what is it? Are you predisposed to being pre-diabetic or diabetic, or
Mm,
what's your cholesterol like? There's so much that needs to be looked at, like screening and panels and the
yeah,
sort. And what's the family history around X, Y, and Z? Are you okay with potentially losing your hair if
mhm,
you are on testosterone?
yeah,
And that being an issue, to where once that damage is done, it's almost very hard to reverse it. Are you okay with these kinds of things? So, and hearing the stories of those with regret,
Mm,
as well, I think is
yeah.
also that. Because the notion is, even though this may sound like, oh, this goes against what you said before about wanting to embrace. No, what I'm saying is, if you still, after all of that, and you've gone through everything, have heard that,
Mhm.
and it still does not deter you, then you may be on to something. You may
Right.
be on to something, and that might help to legitimate all the more about what you would want to do. So to simplify it, I would say know what you are in for. And even with that, to still take your time to reflect. In the book that I have a Venn diagram identity wheel to process
Mm,
that.
mhm.
I have scores of questions through different lenses to reflect on. I have a number of resources, books. I think a lot of that should be done so that you can have the vocabulary to work on this, and not just about wanting to look good. Also, too, are you okay with being an older representation of a
Mm,
trans person? You know, for someone that wants to become the stud or the Chad, uh, that's one thing, and that could probably be pretty easy, right? Or for someone that's, AMAB or AFAB, or you're male to female, to be the young ingenue, that's going to be pretty attractive. A lot of folks are going to want to do that. But can you see yourself also as a middle-aged trans woman? Can you
yeah.
see yourself as an elder trans woman? Can you see yourself as a middle-aged balding man that's
Right.
trans? Can you see yourself as an elder man? Like, can you see yourself through all the phases and the stages, not just in the prime of it,
Right.
but the full cycle of things? So that's what I would offer, is know what you are in for, and look at the risks and see if the risks, are less or greater than the rewards. Look at it.
I'm gonna say, and this is a little tongue in cheek, but I don't think any of us want the to be that middle-aged woman or balding man.
Look at J Lo looking great in her
Right.
50s.
Yeah.
You look at
We want to be that.
Martha Stewart, 80 plus,
Yeah.
on that swimsuit cover.
Right?
I mean, so we've got some folks that are showing people, yeah, you can do the darn thing. That helps to
Yeah.
be worth a couple $100 million too. With that,
Yeah,
we'll
yeah,
we'll
yeah. You
have to
can
have
put a
an LGBTQ plus finance podcast
that's
focus, and
right.
you can call
That's
me
right.
back for that.
But going back to what you said, I think is so important because this is not a all of a sudden one surgery, super easy. Now everything is fixed and you feel in sync with who you are. It's not that simple because, and you just said too, you're turning this, what we're realizing is that gender is this big spectrum,
Yeah,
right? And so a lot of people are going, I don't fit in this. And I feel like part of this is we've created such small little buckets of what it means to be a female or a male. And I don't think many of
right.
us fit in those categories. And
Exactly.
now we're saying there's a much wider version. And by doing some of these surgeries, you're basically trying to put yourself from one little bucket to another little bucket,
Yeah.
rather than saying, where in this big spectrum do I fall? And what does that look like? And so
Yeah, and
giving kids that opportunity to explore that.
yeah, I like what you said, because there's her. I think her name is Alexa. She's very well known in Sweden,
Hmm.
and you may know who I'm referring to.
Hmm.
Yeah, and the last name is like this long, so I don't have that committed to memory. But
Right.
based on what I saw, she's in her late 30s now,
Yeah.
and she transitioned at 18. She's not full out saying that she has regrets,
Mm.
but she did concede that if she could do it all over again, she's not certain that she would have transitioned as quickly, because she did it right
Mm.
at 18, and that's, even at the legal age. And one of the things she said was, well, perhaps I could have been a feminine male
Yeah.
that just did certain things, and this is not to discount anyone's gender dysphoria at all. I'm not saying to discount. No, I'm saying to explore it. And if your truth is that you're trans and you want to explore gender affirming care, when that time is appropriate, then that's something to look into. But that is interesting, to your point, as it states about that spectrum, because there are women that certainly are more masculine in orientation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be on HRT. And I think that we're trying to break past that binary, like I was speaking to, and really looking at that range. And I'm hoping that more of that can happen.
Yeah. And I think it's a great place for parents to come into as well, because it's not a no, right? Because I think when we just throw that no out there, that's just going to make kids even more determined to do it, right? Because they're like, but you're not listening to me. It's more of a let us explore this together. Let's figure out what's the next step. Let's do this first and see where you're comfortable and build up to that. So it's not a no, it's a building up to, which I think is really important.
Absolutely. Yeah, because that's significant. And we're human. We should be allowed to look in to see what can we do to live our best lives and explore with that. That's a part of what makes life worth living.
Right? Exactly. And just finding, I think what's so great and what I do love about the younger generation is I feel like they're far more open than older generations of just accepting people for who they are without the necessary buckets. Even though we all need labels, we all feel more comfortable with labels. And I think that's where they're at, is trying to find what label they fit into, but kind of letting go of some of those labels, but also accepting more of them. And I think that's amazing.
Yeah, accept them, or you create a new one.
You create your own. Isn't that great?
Yeah, you educate people on what it is.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. So Dr. Ronnie, what is something that you want to make sure that parents that have teenagers, particularly ones that are questioning their gender or just questioning their identity in general, what do you want them to walk away with?
I want them to walk away with, number one, it's excellent to begin a dialogue to explore all of the options. Number two, it's a good idea to invest a time commitment in understanding that this is going to likely require a lot of time in contextualizing on both sides. And number three, pairing up with resources so that you can understand the full side, positive and negative, of what this journey, gender journey, human journey can mean. So exploration, time, resources, ETR.
That's amazing. That's great. It's so useful. And that applies to pretty much everything they're doing, interacting with their kids, and all of it. So Dr. Ronnie, how can people find you?
You want to find me, RonnieGladden.com. And I'd love to go and speak at your school or at your college or your nonprofit. You want to check out the book, WhiteGirlWithin.com. We're all the opposite of everything. We're all walking contradictions. And I think the book helps us with that. And you can check me out at Dr. Ronnie Speaks on TikTok or Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram.
All of them. And we will put all the links in the show notes so you can find it. This is great. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really, really thrilled to have you talk to us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Of course. And thank you, parents, for taking time out of your busy day to spend with us. I really appreciate you too. If you want more information on how to best support your teens, check out my top 10 pro parenting tips, drcam.com/parenting tips. Until next time, stay curious. Remember, there's always more to the story than what you see. And we're done.
Oh, that was so good. How long have you done this? It seems like you're such a pro.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for joining me today on Parenting Teens with Dr. Cam. Make sure to visit my website, www.askdrcam.com, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or via RSS. so you'll never miss a show again. While you're at it, if you found value in this episode, I'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, and hey, why not share it with a friend too? Be sure to tune in to my next episode. And remember, parenting teens may not be easy, but with my help, it can be a whole lot easier than this.